Before we begin today, we are going to go over some housekeeping items. For that portion, I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, and welcome everyone. Just a reminder about the once in every 3-year regional rules attendance requirement for membership purposes. If your institution must fulfill that requirement this year, or if your institution is interested in resetting its 3-year clock, you need to head to the NCAA Learning Portal. That can be accessed through My Apps, and there you'll have to view 8 pre-recorded PowerPoint presentations. So at least one institutional representative must watch all 8 by June 30th. Now, while we're really ecstatic that you've joined us today and participating in these webinars themselves do not count for attendance for the 1 in 3 year requirement. So if you have any questions about the membership requirement, please feel free to reach out to Corey Berg at cberg, B-E-R-G, at ncaa.org. Okay. With that, I'd like us to begin to jump in right to our presentation for today. First, again, as Caitlin suggested, really want to welcome you and just thank you for your patience and understanding as we all have worked through unprecedented times to resolve some really difficult issues. We are particularly glad that you've joined us on this session. As Caitlin mentioned before, unprecedented, not the way we normally deliver content for regional rules seminars, but I think we're all growing from this process, and this may be another way in which we grow. I do want to remind you that we are not going to cover the materials that were available through the LMS system that I mentioned earlier. These materials will really build on those foundational elements. So for today, we want to focus really on 3 areas within Bylaw 14. Now, these 3 areas are areas in which we get numerous questions on an annual basis, so that's why we're going to highlight these 3 areas. The first is enrollment requirements, and in particular, we want to talk about the exceptions to those enrollment requirements. So, doesn't a student athlete have to be enrolled full-time in order for that student athlete to be eligible to participate and compete? That's where we want to focus some of our time today. The next is seasons of participation. First, really cover generally when is the season of participation utilized by a student athlete, or when do they use one of those 4 seasons of participation. But also want to talk about some exceptions to the seasons of participation. So what are some instances in which a student athlete is not charged for a season of participation? Finally, Caitlin's going to go over Bylaw 1419. This is the bylaw that really discusses a graduate student's eligibility for participation in a Division III school. So you have a Division III student athlete actually a student athlete who's graduated and wants to compete at a Division III institution. What are those eligibility requirements? And if the student athlete doesn't meet those eligibility requirements, what are the options for the institution at that point? I do want to say right here from the beginning that we are not going to address specifically any COVID-19 related eligibility issues. I would imagine some of the things that we're going to talk about will have some impact on those and may help, but we're not going to directly address those. So the next slide, eligibility requirements. There are some just basic eligibility requirements that all student athletes must meet. First is a student athlete has been admitted to your institution in a degree-seeking program. The next is that the student athlete is actually pursuing that degree at your institution as a full-time student in order for that student athlete to be eligible to participate at your institution. The definition of full-time is different for the undergrad in terms of practice and competition. For practice, that student athlete must be enrolled full-time, and that's really based upon the definition at your institution for any student who's enrolled at your institution. So you may have a particular degree at your program in which full-time is something less than 12 hours. Student athlete can practice while enrolled in that specific program, enrolled less than 12 hours, because that's how you define full-time enrollment for your institution. Competition, on the other hand, though, is a set requirement. It must be no less than 12 semester hours, regardless of how your institution defines full-time enrollment. So for a student athlete to be eligible to compete, then a student athlete must be enrolled in a minimum of 12 semester or quarter hours in order to be eligible for competition. For the graduate student, though, that student is enrolled as a full-time graduate student. And that's really based upon how you define full-time enrollment at your institution for any similarly enrolled graduate student for that particular program. That definition is true for both practice and competition. So if your institution considers full-time enrollment for graduate students to be 9 semester hours, the student athlete, as long as they're enrolled in 9 hours, can both practice and compete. Let's move on to some exceptions. So what happens when a student athlete has completed all their degree requirements and they want to continue to participate through the end of the season? 3 ways a student athlete can do that. First, the postseason event occurs outside the institution's declared playing season and begins within 60 days after the term the student athlete completes their degree requirements. Or the student athlete completes their degree requirements in fewer than 4 academic years from their date of initial full-time collegiate enrollment, and they've already been charged with a season of participation. Or the student athlete continues enrollment in a second degree or as a graduate student at the institution. A common question we receive is, does a student athlete need to meet all 3 of these? And the answer is no. A student athlete only needs to meet one of these 3 in order to be eligible to continue to participate without being enrolled, except if you're in the last one year a graduate student. Then the student athlete would have to be enrolled full-time. So let's turn to an example. Here's a question we received through our SRO fairly recent, last fall. We have a basketball student athlete who graduates in December. That student athlete attended school for 3.5 years. So they've been in school their date of initial full-time enrollment for 3.5 years. Can the student athlete finish their season without having to enroll in the spring term? So student athlete plays in the fall, participates in the fall, graduates at the end of the fall term, now wants to come back but does not want to enroll in school. Can they continue to participate? And the answer is yes. The student athlete would be able to continue to participate without being enrolled. Student athletes' eligibility is really based on that second prong. The student athletes completed their degree requirements in fewer than 4 consecutive academic years. And the student athlete was already charged with a season of eligibility. Because the student athlete participated in the fall, the student athlete and graduate or is eligible for graduation at the end of the fall term, the student athlete can continue to participate to the end of the playing season without having to enroll in any classes for the spring term. Here's another example of a question we received through our SRO. A swimming student athlete graduates in December. They've attended school for 4 years, and they would like to compete in the conference championship that occurs in February without having to enroll in the spring term. So can the student athlete finish their season without enrolling in the spring term? Well, the student athlete hasn't graduated in fewer than 4 consecutive years, so they can't use that portion or the second bulleted item in the list. They're not going to want to enroll in a second degree in a graduate program, so they're not going to use that one. So the only one that we're really looking at is the postseason event begin within 60 days after the end of the term for the student athlete? In this case, we'd look to see, does the postseason event occur within 60 days after the student athlete completed their degree requirements? So the first question to ask is the conference championship the postseason event? And the answer is no. Conference championships are within the declared playing season and are not considered a postseason event for application of this exception. So if that is the only event that is going to occur within 60 days, the student athlete would not be able to use this exception, would have to enroll in order to be eligible to compete. However, if the NCAA championships were to occur within 60 days, now this could be just the beginning round of the NCAA championships, then the student athlete would not have to enroll because a postseason event occurs within 60 days after the last day of the fall term. That's the term in which that student athlete had completed their degree requirements. Another exception to the full-time enrollment requirements is for a student athlete who's in their last term of their degree. In this case, the student athlete can complete their degree requirements with less than a full-time load, then that student athlete may participate while enrolled in less than a full-time program of studies. A couple things the institution needs to make sure exist in order to use this exception. The student athlete's actually in their final term of their undergraduate degree program. or their graduate degree program. The student athlete is taking the classes they need in order to fulfill their degree requirements. It is up to the institution to certify that the student athletes, in fact, in all the classes necessary to complete their degree requirements. So at the end of that term, the student athlete should be able to graduate. If the student athlete fails to complete those courses, the student athlete forfeits all future eligibility. There is no violation. However, the student athlete will forfeit all further eligibility in all sports. I do want to spend a moment here and talk about a non-controversial proposal that Management Council approved in concept at their February meeting. This proposal really expands this definition of the final semester exception to include courses necessary to complete a minor or undergraduate certificate program. A little history about this proposal. ILC began looking at this proposal back in actually September of 2019 and recommended the proposal to Management Council coming out of its February meeting. I say that because it's important to know that the proposal to expand to include minor and undergraduate certificate programs occurred not in response to COVID-19. Now, certainly that's a unique situation. This proposal was really intended to deal with a unique set of circumstances for a question that we get pretty frequently about student athlete who just wants to continue to participate, hasn't graduated, and wants to complete their minor program. It was not intended to address all the unique situations we have as a result of COVID-19. I think, though, Management Council did recognize that it could help some student athletes and wanted to get it into the system as soon as possible. So what this proposal really does is it permits a student athlete who has not graduated, but has completed all the requirements for graduation. So I've completed all the coursework I needed to get my degree. However, I'm also taking a minor that the student athlete would really like to finish. This would allow that student athlete to be able to complete the minor while enrolled in less than a full-time program of studies and still be eligible for competition. A couple things to remember about this proposal. First, it becomes effective August 1, 2020, so it really begins for student athletes enrollment beginning in the fall of 2020. This is not an exception that will be permitted to be used for student athletes who have already graduated. This final term exception can only be used once. It can only be used either for the student athlete to complete their degree requirements or to complete their minor requirements. If the student athlete has already used the exception to complete their degree requirements, example, the student athletes enrolled in less than a full-time program of studies, completed the courses they need to graduate. The student athlete then wants to go another term to complete their minor, they would have to be enrolled full-time because they've already used the exception. And if the student athlete fails to complete the requirements for their minor or their undergraduate certificate program, that student athlete would forfeit all remaining eligibility. Corey, I'll stop, see if there's any questions before I go ahead and move on.
Sure, I've got two for you, Bill. The first one is, what about championships that happen outside of those 60 days following a student athlete's graduation? For example, indoor track and field, and that student athlete does not want to attend graduate school.
Yeah. So the exception wouldn't apply because the track and field championships exist outside the 60 days. So the student athlete can submit a waiver requesting that they be enrolled in less than a full-time program of studies, or the student athlete could return, pursue another undergraduate degree, another undergraduate major, but must be enrolled full-time. So I want to continue on the minor and just give an example of the type of question we received and how we used to answer that question, but now given this non-controversial proposal, the way we'll be able to answer that question moving forward. So the question, as you can see on the screen, says a student athlete wants to take less than a full-time course load during their final term, complete their minor requirements. Now, the student athlete has all the classes they need to graduate, but they're taking an optional minor or a minor not required for their actual degree program, and they'll need 9 hours. Can the student athlete enroll in just those 9 hours and continue to participate? You can see I have under prior response Before that, student athletes would not have been eligible to be enrolled in just those 9 hours. They would have had to enroll full-time because they've taken all their degree applicable courses. And the exception prior to the non-controversial proposal states that a student athlete has to be taking the courses they need in order to fill their degree requirements. Those are already done. The minor is not a required element, so they could not use the exception previously. Now, because of the non-controversial proposal that was adopted by Management Council, a student athlete could enroll in only those 9 hours, complete those 9 hours because that's what's needed to complete their minor or undergraduate certificate program, and the student athlete would be eligible to participate in that particular term because they're carrying the courses they need for that minor. Another important piece to note is the student athlete must designate that minor prior to the beginning of the term in which they want to use the exception. So if a student athlete wanted to use the exception for the fall of 2020, the student athlete would have had to declare the minor or undergraduate certificate program prior to beginning of that fall term. And that really shouldn't be a problem. Most student athletes have really already enrolled in those minors or undergraduate certificate programs, and they've been taking those as part of their other elements that they've been taking as part of their degree. So generally that requirement should not be problematic for most students. Last section I want to talk to is about seasons of participation. And so, as you know, a student athlete has up to 4 seasons of participation. And for Division III, a season of participation is defined as a student athlete who practices or competes during or after the first contest in the traditional segment of the playing season. A couple exceptions to that. If a student athlete during the traditional segment participates in a preseason practice or a preseason scrimmage before the first contest, and the student athlete doesn't participate after that, or participates in an alumni contest and the student athlete doesn't participate after the first scheduled contest. Also for the sports of baseball, field hockey, lacrosse, soccer, softball, and volleyball, the student athlete participates only during the non-traditional segment. So those are some common exceptions for student athletes so they are not charged a season of participation. I want to jump ahead to an actual case that we received through RSRO. So we have an individual who's a team manager in the sport of volleyball. They were a manager in the fall term. And now it's the spring term and the student athlete wants to participate with the team in practice and competition during that non-traditional segment of the playing season. In addition, the student athlete wants to go on a foreign tour with the team and practice with the team in preparation for that foreign tour. So 3 questions the institution asked. Can the student athlete practice compete during the non-traditional season and not get charged a season of participation? Can the student athlete practice with the team during the allotted time before the foreign tour, those 10 practice opportunities, and not use a season of participation? And can the student athlete actually go on the foreign tour and not be charged with a season of participation? So for the first question, can the student athlete participate in the non-traditional season, not get charged with a season of participation? Volleyball is one of those sports that's listed in the exception. That says that if the student athlete participates in the non-traditional segment only, the student athlete does not trigger a season of participation. So the student manager participating with the volleyball team in the non-traditional segment would not get charged with a season of participation. The other 2 questions dealing more with the foreign tour, can they practice with the team in preparation for the foreign tour, or can they actually go on the foreign tour? The student manager can participate in the activities both leading up to and actually in the foreign tour without triggering using a season of participation. The specific bylaw, there's an exception, is a 14.2.4.7. States that a student athlete who didn't compete during the season but is only participating as part of the foreign tour wouldn't be charged with a season of participation for the prior academic year. So this student athlete, because they didn't participate during the fall term, the participation was limited to the non-traditional segment, and the student athlete is only participating in the foreign tour, student athlete wouldn't get charged with a season of participation for that prior year. Corey, I'll stop to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, Bill, we've got one based on your discussion of the non-controversial legislation in the minor, if the student athlete participates in a spring graduation ceremony, would they be unable to continue their minor in the fall or the following spring in order to use their remaining eligibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. For purposes of that exception, we define a graduation as a student athlete has fulfilled all academic and administrative requirements. So they've applied for graduation, they have fulfilled all the academic requirements, so the institution would consider the student athlete to be a graduate. So I'm not sure in that situation if the institution would consider that student athlete to be a graduate. They may let the student athlete walk without the student athlete actually having completed all the paperwork. I think that is up to every institution. But if the student athlete is considered a graduate by the institution, the student athlete could not use that particular exception. However, because that question sounds like it's somewhat COVID related, the institution does have the ability to go and request a waiver from the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief, requesting that student athlete be permitted to potentially be able to return to school and not be enrolled full time. I will actually turn to Caitlin. And Caitlin, if you have anything to add about the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief portion of that question.
Sure. So the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief has had discussions about if your senior student athletes are wanting to return this upcoming year to take advantage of their extra season or semester of participation that was granted to them through the administrative committee's flexibility and blanket waiver. We've started to receive requests for waivers of less than full-time enrollment for this upcoming academic year. Specifically, we're seeing it in the context of the non-traditional segment in the fall, not being enrolled full-time. So what does that look like? And what does the subcommittee want to see in order to grant relief of the full-time enrollment requirement for participation? This is outlined in the COVID-19 Q&A, but at the minimum, what the subcommittee has directed staff to take a look at is that the student athletes looking to do this or looking to participate while enrolled less than full-time must be students at a minimum. That means they must be enrolled. So they're going to be looking at the academic plan for the entire academic year, specifically to see that the courses that the student athletes are taking either advance their academic plans, potentially, you know, in the case of if you're taking classes for a minor, or they advance their career plans, otherwise beneficial courses for their career. The plan needs to be certified by the appropriate academic authorities outside of athletics. So those are some of the parameters that the subcommittee has set for their review and for staff's review of these types of waiver requests. The subcommittee has rendered a couple decisions on waivers in this space. One, you know, where it was approved because the waiver met all of those requirements. One, the waiver was denied because the participants, the student athletes, were seeking to participate in the fall segment, the non-traditional segment, while not enrolled at all. So they wouldn't be students. So their decisions have been consistent with the guidance that's provided in the Q&A. Bill, does that sufficiently address?
Yeah, great. Yeah, Caitlin, so as you mentioned, really two components, that the student athlete is a student, they're enrolled in some classes, and that those classes are intentional, that they are preparing the student either for future academic or career, whatever they're going to be doing next. Okay, great. Caitlin, with that, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, so we're going to kick it off with grad student post-baccalaureate participation. So once a student graduates with their undergraduate degree, the only way they can be eligible at a Division III institution is if they meet this one bylaw, 1419. So you'll see the prongs laid out. The first prong is kind of built into that first paragraph. The student athlete must have graduated from a Division III institution. So this can be your Division III institution or another Division III institution, but only D3 graduates can be eligible under Division III legislation. So the second requirement is that the student athlete must be enrolled and seeking a graduate or second baccalaureate degree at your institution. This means that the student athlete cannot just be enrolled in courses for a graduate certificate program or a minor. The third requirement is the student athlete must have eligibility remaining, and this means they must have at least one season of participation remaining. And lastly, the student athlete must have semesters or quarters remaining within their 10-semester or 15-quarter eligibility period. So who does not meet this legislation? And this is where we see the waivers come in. Who does not meet this legislation would include graduates from Divisions I, Division II, NAIA, and foreign institutions. So the only way that those student athletes can become eligible is through a legislative relief waiver. And as you can imagine, many graduates from non-Division III institutions pursue this waiver option once they've been accepted into a graduate program at a Division III institution. Because there's such a higher volume of those types of waivers, the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief has established a directive for waivers of Bylaw 1419 that, when satisfied, will result in the waiver being approved. So the ultimate authority on this directive was President's Council, and you can find these criteria for the directive on ncaa.org on the D3 compliance page under legislative relief waivers. We've included the link on the slide. So this directive provides graduate student eligibility for student athletes who have demonstrated compelling and exemplary academic success at a previous institution, and it's provided relief of Bylaw 1419 since 2008. So the criteria for the directive was changed last year by President's Council, and those changes are reflected on the slide. It's important to note where we were and where we are today with this directive, because the subcommittee has advised staff to temporarily consider student athletes seeking this type of waiver relief under the former standards as well as the new. And the current directive has 4 criteria, so you'll see that on the screen. The student athlete must have graduated in 4 academic years. The student athlete must have seasons of participation remaining per Division III legislation. And let's pause on that point really quick. What do we know that's unique to Division III? Practice after the first contest in the traditional segment will result in the use of a season. So we're considering not only competition, but practice when we look at Bylaw 14241 for this prong. This will require a little bit more detail for compliance to ensure the transfer rates are accurate from the previous institution. The previous institution may only make the seasons used based on the previous institution's rules. So, like I said, if you're going to be D1 and D2 graduates, under their legislation, they only use a season of participation or season of competition when they compete. So it may require that extra step of you reaching out to their compliance officer to confirm that when they're checking seasons of participation used, they're including practice. So the third point is that the student athlete must have maintained continuous full-time enrollment during their undergraduate experience. And the final criterion is that the student athlete must have achieved a minimum of a 3.0 GPA. So you will note on the slide that the first prong crosses out the requirement that the student athlete graduate ahead of schedule. That was a requirement of the old directive. Instead, it's replaced with a student athlete graduating within 4 academic years. So this change was a product of the subcommittee's recognition that many difficult academic programs do not allow for early graduation. So therefore, early graduation isn't always indicative of compelling and exemplary academic success. You'll also note that the second criterion regarding student athlete having seasons of participation is bolded and underlined. This is intended to show that this is a new requirement that was not part of the old 3-prong directive. This change speaks to the intent that underlines the Division III's higher standard for graduate student participation. The intent of the directive was to limit graduate student participation to academically excellent students, so that there wasn't this undesirable recruiting focus on Division I and II redshirts who could feasibly take advantage of 5 seasons of participation per Division III rules by practicing their first year or one of their years and competing the remaining 8 semesters or 4 years. So this requirement is intended to eliminate that concern. So I'm going to pause there before we jump to the next slide. Are there any questions, Corey, that need to be addressed?
Yeah, Caitlin, I've got one. Has there been any discussion that would allow institutions to self-apply this sort of waiver relief, or does everything have to come through staff?
At this time, there is no previously approved waiver that could be applied on campus. Certainly that's something that could be discussed in the future, but if you do have Division I, Division II, NAIA, or foreign institution graduates, you would need to file an individual legislative relief waiver for each of them with staff.
Awesome. Good to keep going, Caitlin.
Great. So to summarize, the staff in the subcommittee will be temporarily reviewing the eligibility of graduate or post-baccalaureate students under both the new directive and the criteria for the former directive when you apply for a waiver. So the chart on the slide here is to help serve as a checklist for you when your coach comes to you and wanting to recruit one of those graduates who doesn't graduate from a Division III institution. Generally, they will need to satisfy all criteria in either the left or right column. It's really important to note that the subcommittee has identified that students, they will not consider relief by looking at a hybrid of both models. They need to be one or the other. So with that, we're going to dive into some case studies that put the directive and the former directive to the test. So the first one, the student athlete graduated from a Division I institution with a 3.2 cumulative GPA. The student athlete took advanced placement courses in high school, and with those extra credits, the student athlete was able to graduate after 7 consecutive semesters or in 3.5 years. And the student athlete was enrolled full-time each of those semesters. The student athlete has practiced and competed in a total of 3 seasons of volleyball. So remember, this table is your checklist for the directive. And because we're moving away from the former directive and we're not sure just how long the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief will consider temporarily reviewing waivers under the former directive criteria, it's my recommendation that when you're submitting a waiver, you look at it first through this lens of the current directive. Would this graduate meet the current directive? So for this one, we know the student athlete graduated within 4 years and only participated in 3 seasons. We know the student athlete was enrolled full-time consecutively and had a 3.2 GPA. The student athlete meets all prongs of the new directive. And for good measure, we know the student athlete would also satisfy the old directive because the student athlete graduated early in 3.5 years. The next case, a student athlete graduated from a Division II institution with a cumulative 2.62 GPA. The student athlete graduated upon completion of 8 semesters within 4 years and was enrolled full-time each semester. The student athlete never participated in athletics at the student athlete's previous institution and has 4 seasons of participation remaining in football. Again, let's look at this under the lens of the new directive, or I guess it's been a year, but the current directive. We can first check off the first and third prongs because we know the student athlete graduated in 8 semesters with no breaks in full-time enrollment. So we know we graduated within 4 years, had no breaks in full-time enrollment. We can check off the second prong because we know the student athlete has not used any seasons of participation per Division III rules. However, we know the student athlete did not have at least a 3.0 GPA. Because of that, they would fail both the current directive and they'd fail the former directive because of the GPA requirement. So, student athlete does not meet either directive. Does that result in automatic denial? No. So even though the student athlete does not satisfy all criteria of the directive, the staff may approve under student athlete well-being or a totality of circumstances rationale and consider other extenuating circumstances. In fact, the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief has a guideline that directs staff to do just that, to consider extenuating circumstances. But the really important question here is what's considered compelling enough to warrant relief when you don't meet this directive. So here, the only other mitigation put forward is that the student athlete never participated in college athletics, so there's no competitive advantage gained. Should that alone warrant relief? The subcommittee has taken a firm position that no, non-participation in intercollegiate athletics alone should not warrant relief of Bylaw 1419. So with that direction, this waiver would be denied.
Hey, Caitlin, we've got one question about the current and the former directive. How long will we still consider things under the former directive and go completely to the current directive?
That's a good question. The subcommittee has not provided an exact timeline for that. I think that as the subcommittee continues to meet, biannually, they'll review whether it's appropriate to continue to consider relief under the directive criteria. I think the intent was to allow for a little bit of an adjustment period, and knowing that the current directive has been in place for a year now, the subcommittee will probably revisit that discussion soon. So that's why I think it's encouraged to look at everything under the current directive, because we're just not sure how much longer the former directive criteria will be considered.
Thanks, that's it.
All right, moving right along, we're on our final case study. The student athlete graduated from a Division I institution upon completion of 8 semesters within 4 years and possessing a 3.1 cumulative GPA. The student athlete was full-time each semester. Student athlete competed in 3 seasons of basketball, and they also redshirted during their first year because of a persistent back injury. The student athlete practiced the entire season that they had that back injury. So, moving right along to our analysis under the current directive, would the student athlete satisfy all prongs? The student athlete graduated in 8 semesters, so within 4 years, we can check that first box. But we cannot check the second box because the student athlete used 4 seasons of participation per Division III rules. Specifically, as we discussed earlier, practice after the first contest in the traditional segment is considered the use of a season. So the student athlete effectively used a full season of participation that first year when they practiced. So let's look at the old directive because we know they don't meet the current directive. Well, we know the student athlete would not satisfy the first prong because the student athlete graduated within 4 years and not ahead of schedule. So again, we have a student athlete who did not satisfy either directive requirements. Is there anything else that's considered compelling here that should warrant relief? The subcommittee did not think so. So here the emphasis was on the use of a season. In this case, the student athlete's practice used a season of participation. So the other mitigation that might have been put forward along with that, like, whether the student athlete got a lot of game time or was a highly contributing member of the team during that practice that year, would not change the competitive advantage that was considered to be gained. And remember that the subcommittee has a guideline that says non-participation alone is not considered compelling mitigation to warrant relief. So with no other mitigation asserted in this waiver was denied.
All right, how about if the criteria of the directive is met and the graduate student athlete has multiple seasons remaining, can the student athlete go consecutive falls while they take a break in the spring and use those seasons that they have left for multiple fall seasons of participation?
So I think that would, so you're saying the waiver's already granted, so we're out of Bylaw 1419, and we're talking about how can the student athlete be eligible each semester and while they're taking advantage of their additional seasons. I may recruit Bill to weigh in on this, but I think, as Bill noted earlier, the student athlete who's a graduate student or post-baccalaureate student at a minimum needs to be enrolled full-time per the definition of the institution. If they're looking to participate, so in your example, when you say that they want to enroll in the fall and participate in the season but not enroll in the spring, they need to otherwise meet all eligibility requirements for your institution. So that probably includes the satisfactory progress requirements. So if that type of enrollment arrangement works for your satisfactory progress requirements, both conference and institutional, and they're full-time or otherwise meeting some type of full-time exception, I imagine that arrangement might work. So did you have anything to add?
Sorry, Caitlin, I was on mute. I think I want to try to understand, and Corey, maybe you can help me with the question correctly. So the student athlete meets the criteria for 1419, wants to come back as a graduate student, wants to know, can they come back fall 1, take a break, fall 2? Is that what they're asking? That, Corey, is that the question?
Yeah, Bill, that's how I'm interpreting that question.
Yeah. So if the student otherwise is full-time, goes 1419, is eligible, what really would be the two things to keep in mind. One, does a student athlete have available full-time terms? So as long as they have 2 available full-time terms, they don't have to use those consecutively under 1419, right? They can use one, take a break, use another, but the institution also has to be aware of its institutional or any conference satisfactory progress or academic requirements that may be in place, because the student athlete will, in addition to full-time enrollment, would have to be otherwise academically eligible. So I don't know if there's a residency requirement or some other institutional requirement, but in terms of just being eligible full-time, they don't have to be consecutive terms.
Caitlin, I've got another one for you. Is the new directive for student athletes who are just graduate students, or is it also applicable for second degree seeking students?
So it's applicable for second degree seeking students as well. It's really any student who doesn't satisfy 1419, so any D1, D2, NAIA, or foreign institution graduate, whether they're pursuing a graduate program or they're pursuing a second baccalaureate degree at your institution, they would be evaluated under this directive, but it could be under either a graduate program or a second baccalaureate.
Thanks.
All right. So some of the key takeaways for the case studies here, a student athlete may be granted eligibility for graduate or post-baccalaureate eligibility based on either the former criteria temporarily or the new criteria for the directive for compelling and exemplary academic success. The subcommittee will not consider relief under a hybrid of both. Non-participation in intercollegiate athletics alone is not sufficient mitigation that's going to result in relief. And just some other considerations to keep in mind. The first is that I don't want to discourage anyone from not filing a legislative relief waiver if the student athlete does not meet the directive. Staff does have the ability to consider other extraordinary and extenuating circumstances that are appropriately documented. So for example, if a student athlete wants to seek graduate student eligibility at a Division III institution because it's close to home and it allows the student athlete to continue caregiving responsibilities for a terminally ill parent, that is an example where when it was appropriately documented, the relief was provided. So relief can be provided outside of the directive, but it needs to be pretty compelling, extraordinary, extenuating circumstances, and staff consider that. Military service is also considered, and that's part of the guidelines. For example, if a student athlete took a break from full-time enrollment to participate in basic training for military service, we know that break in enrollment maybe doesn't meet the directive, but that military service can be considered as maybe a reason outside of their control, but it's something that we've also seen as mitigation. So some other things to note: in order for a Division III institution to file a waiver, the student athlete must have graduated and be accepted into and enrolled into a graduate or post-baccalaureate program. I think the design behind this is just that student athletes aren't shopping around as grad students for different institutions to file legislative relief waivers. We're not seeing multiple legislative relief waivers on one student athlete's behalf. They need to be admitted into your graduate program. Another thing that staff sees is just because the student athlete's desired degree program is not available at their former D1 or D2 institution, that unavailability of the degree program alone is not going to be considered compelling mitigation to warrant relief, and that's provided in the subcommittee's guidelines. So with that, that concludes the graduate post-baccalaureate eligibility waiver discussion. Are there any questions, Corey, that came in?
Yeah, I've got one for you, Caitlin. What is the best way to certify how many seasons a non-Division III student athlete has remaining? Should a school send a tracer? Should they go to the transfer portal? Should they do something completely different? Can you give a little advice on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that while there's nothing that's really outlined in the legislation for how to do it, I think best practice, what we've seen is transfer tracers can be particularly helpful. But as I noted earlier, they might not be foolproof because you've got transfer tracers coming from Divisions 1 and 2 who only count competition as the use of a season. So what I was suggesting perhaps is if that transfer tracer says the student athlete only used 3 seasons, it may require a follow-up phone call with the previous institution's compliance office to make sure that the student athlete didn't also have a redshirt year where they were practicing. And sometimes you can be tipped off by that if the transfer tracer suggests that a student athlete practiced their freshman year and then competed the next 3 years. That kind of tips off the compliance office to know that, all right, well, maybe that practice occurred after the first contest in the traditional segment and therefore may not meet the Division III legislation for purposes of the waiver directive. So the transfer tracer is a good starting place, but I think as a starting point, it might require a follow-up phone call.
Awesome, thank you. I've got another one here. For that second prong of the current directive, if a non-Division III graduate comes bearing a medical hardship waiver, how does that fit into the analysis for 1419?
I believe that, you know, if the student athlete receives a season back from their previous division, so they come from Division I and they were granted a Division I hardship waiver, the staff would recognize that season, they got that season back for purposes of this directive.
I've got a question for Bill. What if your institution doesn't do their credits in something that would add up to 12? So what if your student athletes could be considered full-time at 4 or 6 or something different? What do you advise institutions in that situation to do?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Corey. So there's legislation that speaks to that. So if a school bases their calendar on some non-traditional academic calendar, or if they have their credit hours on something less than a 12 semester hours, obviously, you know, for example, you're in 3 units, the institution equates that to being in 12 semester hours. The institution should file a waiver seeking relief for a non-traditional academic calendar. And then once it has that in place, the institution then can go ahead and certify student athletes based upon that particular waiver criteria. So the legislation literally says 12 hours. So if you do it on something other than 12 hours, you should be filing a non-traditional academic calendar waiver.
Again, it's something we're either not asking Caitlin or Bill, or if I haven't had a chance to shoot you an answer in the chat, feel free to throw those into RSRO. Sometimes some of the more detailed specific questions are best handled in that area.
And before we wrap up today, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Again, it's a non-traditional format, so we appreciate your flexibility. And like Corey said, if you have any follow-up questions regarding the information presented, please reach out to staff through your compliance officer and the RSRO system. Thank you again. Have a great afternoon. Bill, any other remarks?
No, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.